Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bimmer barn. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the shocks and springs on your E90 or E92 BMW. And today's video is very special because we're going to be working on my friend Tyler's 335 diesel. This car is fully upgraded with turbos, downpipe, everything that you can do to get these cars tuned up, as well as it's been meticulously maintained and it's fully spec'd out from factory with all the options you could ask for. I'd love to make some really cool content on this car, so if you're interested, let me know with a comment down below what you'd like to see, whether it's a build breakdown or maybe a dyno day. But without further ado, let's go ahead and show you the vehicle and then we'll get right to work on installing the suspension. So now with the car in the air, we can go ahead and take a look at the suspension that we're gonna be installing for today. And as you can see in front of me, we have the Koni Active Sport shocks combined with the eye-back lowering springs. And these actually came with a full set of OEM hardware to go along with the install. And the struts actually came preloaded. So preloaded meaning that the springs already came installed on the strut in the front, and the mount as well has been pre-installed, and it's a brand new OEM mount. Now the reason it came preloaded is because Tyler bought this suspension package from a place called strutmonkey.com, and basically this is exactly what they specialize in, is you buy a suspension kit and they will hand assemble it for you, making sure everything is torqued to spec so you can just throw it right on the car. And they'll also make sure that they source the OEM hardware so you can replace all the bushings when you do get your suspension installed. So that's a really cool service of them to provide. I'm not affiliated nor sponsored with them by any means, but just something you guys might want to check out in case you don't have a spring compressor at home and you want to save the time like we're going to be saving today. So let's go ahead and take a look at the car. We're going to start in the front, and here in the front you can see this strut and spring. Now I believe this is a factory spring, but this is a Koni aftermarket shock. I believe this is an older model compared to the red ones that we have right here, and we're going to be replacing it today. Now to remove it, what I generally like to do is remove the sway bar end link, which is held on by this bolt right here, and then come to the top of the car and loosen the 3 bolts that hold the strut mount on. And that way the strut should come down and we should be able to swing it out of the fender liner here. And then we're gonna go ahead and get the 1 bolt on the back here that clamps the strut to the axle here, and then we'll be able to slide the strut out. So the fronts are really easy to do. And since, like I said, we don't have to change the springs or get a spring compressor out, we're just gonna be able to slide these new ones in, and then we'll move on to the rear of the car, which is a little bit different in terms of installation, but I'll show you that when we get there. So let's go ahead now and remove the front struts and install the new ones. Now I've almost got the strut down and out, but because there's still preload on the bushing here, the axle doesn't want to go down as far as it can go. So I'm going to use an 18mm to release, just loosen that bolt there on the control arm. that should release the preload. This other bushing here is actually an E90 M3 control arm, so it doesn't have any preload for the rear control arm bushing right here, but we're gonna loosen that one, should get this to drop low enough. And then when we reinstall the new stuff, we need to remember to load up the suspension and then tighten down the bolt so that the bushing is preloaded in the front there. So let's go ahead, loosen this up. So once we've got the strut to this point where we can almost get it out, we're gonna go ahead and break loose that bolt that clamps it. Oh, shit. There we go. Like I was saying, we're gonna loosen this bolt here. That way when we swing it out, we can go ahead and remove the strut, because you don't wanna be putting too much pressure on the brake line here, because you see we are kind of stretching it a little bit. You don't want to be stretching it for too long or too hard. So you got to be careful about that when you do this. We'll go ahead and remove this bolt all the way. Now with this bolt out of the way, we should be able to swing the strut out, remove it. Let's see if it's loose in there. Oh no, it's not. So this is a spreader socket. I'll put a link to it in the description below, but it's made for this. It's supposed to widen that gap there so that the strut can come out nice and easy. There we go. All right, so we'll swing this out. And there you go. And remember, since you don't have the strut in there anymore, you're gonna have to find something to hang the axle in. So again, you're not putting too much pressure on that brake line. Now though, we're gonna make sure we have everything ready and we'll start installing the new strut. So now we've got both struts installed on the E90 in the front. And I wanted to mention that on this side, the passenger side, you do need to remove the ride level sensor arm that's on the control arm. Otherwise, when you lower this axle down, it's gonna go ahead and bend that bracket. So remove that arm before you do the strut on this side, but as you can see, we've already finished. So let's go ahead now and move to the back of the car. So here we've got the new rear spring and rear shock, and I just wanna show you guys what it looks like with the bottom mount and the top mounts installed. Now, essentially what we're gonna do to remove the spring is we're gonna loosen this bolt here so that the shock can come separate from the spring carrier, and that spring carrier is what holds the spring to the chassis of the car. So you'll see that's what I'm talking about right here. This big old beam right here carries the spring, and then the shock itself goes right in the middle there. So we're gonna remove the nut that holds the shock and then the bolt that holds the spring carrier to the axle, and then it should be able to swing about this axis right here, and we should be able to get the spring out. And then for the shock itself, we're gonna remove and replace the bottom mount here, but to get to the top of the shock, we have to go into the trunk. So that's definitely one of the more annoying parts about installing suspension in the rear of the E90 or the E92, same thing, is that you're gonna have to remove all of the trunk pieces. Everything in your trunk has to go, guys. And for the E93s, it's even more difficult because of all the convertible components and those things getting in the way. So now that you guys know what we're doing, let's go ahead and get right to work. Now, as you saw, I removed the rear struts, and these are a little tricky to remove by yourself. If I'm honest, what I like to do generally is put a vice clamp, like some vice grips, on the top of the strut here, and that way it keeps the rod stationary so you can go into the trunk and get the nut that holds it from the inside. It does create a little bit of scratching up here, which really isn't recommended, but what's nice is that the strut doesn't actually travel all the way up that far because you have the bump stop. So the seal from the piston here is never gonna touch this part of the strut rod. So I don't think it's a big deal, but if you wanted to do it another way, you can go ahead and put an Allen wrench inside of the inner rod here, and then you can use like a ratcheting wrench around the outside on the nut and slowly work it, but that just requires a lot more time. And personally, I like to use my power tools whenever I can. So like I said, we've got them out now, and I did want to show you guys that I found the previous bushings that were installed for the top mounts that go up into the trunk. They're actually aftermarket rubber bushings, and I was actually thinking of reusing these for a second because, you know, aftermarket, a little bit more sport oriented and should last longer, you would think, than these foam bushings from factory. But what I realized looking closer is that it actually shows signs of wear and cracking. And so again, this is why I don't prefer rubber bushings. I prefer polyurethane bushings, especially in this case. PowerFlex does make an aftermarket solution just like this, but out of polyurethane, and it's not going to deteriorate over time like this rubber, which is clearly drying out. And I would be afraid to reinstall this in the car because you don't know how many more years are left on these bushings before they completely fall apart like plastic. So we're going to be installing the OEM foam bushings here, and these are going to create a really comfortable ride as well as eliminate any noise coming from the strut into the car, you know, through the trunk. So let's go ahead and get to installing the struts now with all of our new hardware and then the new springs as well. All right, so now we're done with the rears, and just a couple of tips. You guys saw me use a little bit of degreaser up here on the rubber boot of the bushing that goes into the chassis. That's just to make sure that it slides in perfectly and that it doesn't get caught up like the old bushings were. And then the spring, make sure that you install these springs in the correct orientation. So they do have the company's logo on them, and you want to make sure that you can read them upright while they're installed, and that would indicate that they're installed correctly. And then remember, on the other side, you are going to have that ride level arm on the spring carrier, so be sure to loosen the 10mm bolt on top of that before pulling down the spring carrier to get the spring out. So now let's go ahead and tidy up the trunk here, and then we'll put the wheels on the car and we'll take it for a test drive. Then when we get back, we're going to make some measurements so we can compare and see how much lower the car is before and after. So now that we're back home safe and sound after our test drive and everything is torqued down, including the wheels, let's go ahead now and make a measurement to see what our final height is. Now, I did make measurements before to see how tall the car was with the factory springs and sport shocks, but now let's go ahead and remeasure it, and then I'll go ahead and flash the measurements up on screen so you can see how much lower we got the car. So that's gonna conclude our video for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Hopefully this video helped you install coilovers or suspension, lowering springs, whatever it is on your BMW 3 Series. And if you enjoy this sort of content, be sure to leave a like or a comment down below and subscribe to the channel if you're new and you haven't yet. As always, I hope everyone has an amazing day, and we will see you in the next video.